The DreamCast. With the Shenmue remasters released, bringing the classics to mainstream gaming audiences for the first time in nearly 20 years, we thought it'd be worthwhile to talk about the console that made these remarkable classics possible. In an era where the console space was dominated by systems that could barely handle Quake, Sega's Dreamcast was the very first 6th-gen console, offering gamers a truly revolutionary experience in the late 90s. Though the Dreamcast and Sega's dreams of staying in the hardware space were sunk by the juggernaut that was the PS2, it remains a console well ahead of its time. Now, before we take a deep dive into the Dreamcast's hardware, let's have a quick look at the context. What was the console space like way back in 1998? For starters, it was dominated by 5th-gen platforms, primarily the PSX and the N64. Sega's own Saturn had by then been shelved. Its complicated dual CPU architecture was difficult to code for, and a comparative lack of big number first-party titles put it in an untenable position. The cancellation of Sonic X-treme, which was set to be the first 3D Sonic game, proved the last nail in the box, leaving the Saturn with nothing to compare to the likes of the seminal Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64. The Saturn was host to some exceptional sprite-based games. However, Saturn hardware proved hard to work with for 3D, a situation that meant that the Saturn had fewer polygonal 3D games, and those it did have tended to compare poorly compared to the other two consoles on the market. The PSX and the N64 offered a substantially better 3D gaming experience than the Saturn. However, 5th-gen consoles were underdeveloped in a time before dedicated video graphics became mainstream. As a result, there was something of a hard limit in terms of what could be achieved on 5th-gen hardware. Very low resolution, blocky, low poly models, and flat lighting. The arrival of the Dreamcast, featuring dedicated Power VR graphics, therefore resulted in one of the most profound generational leaps in fidelity, with early titles like Soul Calibur and Shenmue offering experiences far, far beyond the capabilities of earlier consoles. We'll be taking a deep dive into what made the Dreamcast tick. Let's go ahead and start with a quick appraisal of the key hardware specs. The console consisted of a CPU powered by Hitachi SH4 at 200 MHz, a PowerVR CLX2 at 100 MHz GPU, with 8 MB VRAM, 16 MB SD RAM of RAM at 100 MHz, and 56K modem, VMUs as extras. The Dreamcast utilized a processor from Hitachi, the same vendor who provided the SH2 processor for the Sega Saturn. The SH4 clocked at 200 MHz and featuring a superscalar architecture offering nearly 3 times the raw compute power of the N64, 360 MIPS, million instructions per second, as compared to the 125 MIPS on the N64. The SH4 superscalar design provided a key boost. Superscalar architecture allows for 2 or more instructions to be run at a time. The SH4 had a further trick up its sleeve in the form of dedicated floating point unit, the FPU. The FPU handled floating point operations for 3D graphics. The Dreamcast featured 16 MB of system RAM, separate from the GPU's 8 MB of dedicated video memory. This is a substantial step up from the 5th gen. The N64 had 4.5 MB of RAM, expandable up to 9 MB with the expansion pack. Larger amounts of memory are in part what made the expansive open-world titles like Shenmue, with the need to handle large numbers of objects, possible. Much of what made the Dreamcast such a graphical powerhouse for the time was its inclusion of a dedicated PowerVR graphics unit. Interestingly enough, the PowerVR CLX2 was not Sega's first choice for powering the Dreamcast visuals, and ended up in the console largely due to a PR fiasco. Sega had initially shown interest in utilizing 3DFX hardware for the Dreamcast. However, in the aftermath of an apparent 3DFX leak regarding the Dreamcast, when the console was still under wraps, Sega opted against further collaboration with that company. This was a decision with historic consequences. 3DFX, then a market leader in the graphics space, went bankrupt by 2001 and had actually settled a court case against Sega in its favor to the tune of $10.5 million. 3DFX's Voodoo 2 hardware was notably more powerful than the PowerVR CLX2, and would have helped the Dreamcast better compete with later 6th-gen arrivals like the PS2 and the GameCube. It might have even resulted in 3DFX not fading into obscurity, but at the end of the day, it was PowerVR CLX2 that actually went inside the machine. The CLX2 could output 7 million polys per second, an order of magnitude greater than the PS1 or the N64. This is best seen close up in games like Shenmue, where smooth, high-poly models featured distinct facial features, hair, and fingers, as opposed to the blockiness characteristics of the 5th gen. The CLX2 also featured a set of additional features that contributed much to the Dreamcast's look. Hardware support for full-screen anti-aliasing meant that the Dreamcast games immediately looked smoother than their later PS2 counterparts with fewer jaggies. The CLX2 had 8 megabytes of dedicated video memory. This was a large amount for the time and enabled many Dreamcast titles to run at a native 480p on TVs. The PS2, in contrast, generally runs games at a sub-native resolution and didn't have hardware support for AA, both of which led to the PS2 actually having inferior image quality as compared to the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was the first console to support online play. A 56K dial-up modem was included with each unit sold. In 1998, online multiplayer was the exclusive realm of PC. With the inclusion of a dial-up modem, the Dreamcast's online multiplayer functionality enabled console gamers to frag online for the first time. Incredibly, some Dreamcast games are still online, notably Phantasy Star, Quake 3, and Alien Front. The Dreamcast VMUs, visual memory units, were another feature that were well ahead of their time. VMUs were something of a hybrid between memory cards and handheld devices for minigames. The VMU was a truly versatile device. It held user saves, of course, but it also offered second-screen experiences and multiplayer minigames by connecting VMUs together. Sounds suspiciously like a particular Nintendo console that's currently selling like hotcakes? The Dreamcast was, indeed, a machine ahead of its time. By incorporating elements of online play and second-screen experiences, among others, the Dreamcast laid the groundwork for new types of gaming paradigms, most notably observed in the Switch. Sadly, Sega's financial troubles and relatively low sales in the face of the PS2 resulted in the Dreamcast being prematurely pulled from the production line. It will, nevertheless, live on in our hearts, something that's substantially easier to do now that those Shenmue remasters are finally out. So now go play them, they're absolute classics. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.